My guest tonight is Gearóid Ó Colmáin, right? Gearóid Ó Colmáin, right? Gearóid, is that how you pronounce it?
That's it. Yep.
Okay, that's the Gaelic name. Gearóid is a journalist and a political analyst based in Paris. His work focuses on globalization, geopolitics, and class struggle. He's a regular contributor to Dissident Voice, Global Research, Russia Today International, and Press TV. Hey, Gearóid, how are you doing today?
Great. Thanks for having me on, Timothy.
Well, thank you for coming on the show. So we want to talk to you about. You've made a number of well, you've written a lot, and you also made a number of. You've had a number of interviews where you've addressed a lot of uncomfortable truths regarding recent terrorist attacks, so-called, in Europe. You have the last month the attacks in Brussels. We had the Paris attacks in November of 2015, and earlier in the year the Charlie Hebdo attacks. It seems that is a part of a strategy of tension, a Gladio 2.0, if you will. Would you agree?
I would absolutely, yeah. The thing about it is that I think the first thing to say, I suppose, with the war on terrorism is that there is an increasing divide between the ruling class and the people in Western societies, and that is a reflection of growing inequalities. You know, we only have to look at the statistics about inequalities in the world. The world is coming increasingly under the control of a financial oligarchy, and that's an open secret, you know. So it's that creates states that are increasingly antisocial, and so we see that in Europe you have austerity being imposed by these political and financial elites. And the war on terror is really just about maintaining a security state at home so as to prevent any major social change and to protect the interests of the financial oligarchy, and about driving the military-industrial complex and the endless foreign wars that are necessary to keep the permanent war economy going. The three main powers in question here, the United States, France, and Britain, are major arms producers and depend very much on the sales of arms. And you need enemies if you're going to be selling arms all the time. So you need war. And of course, war is useful also for distracting people, and it's you know, war. All of the foreign wars are about the desire to get control of natural resources, pillaging Africa, stealing oil, gas, important minerals and gold and so on. So the mythology is a key aspect of the way in which war is presented to the public. And the thing about it is, if you read the works of some of the most important people in the history of international law, you can read about this. You know, you can Grotius writes about this in his famous book on peace, on war and peace. You know, it says that there are, when governments want to go to war, they basically tell lies about the real reasons for going to war. So the war on terror is a big fraud. There is no real enemy in the war on terror. The enemies are fabricated, and they are being used in the West to keep people down, to keep people divided, to spread fear, and to justify an antisocial state. So the attacks in Europe serve that purpose. So there's, yes, Gladio, of course, is something that has, even though it was actually officially denounced by the European Parliament in 1990, and they demanded an investigation. It rarely gets media coverage. There were a few articles in the French media about it. I wrote about that for American Herald Tribune recently. After the attacks, the Gladio operation was mentioned. Well, they didn't actually mention Gladio, but they mentioned the attacks that were happening in Italy in the 1970s, and the fact that secret services were involved. But you're not allowed, of course, question Gladio in terms of or question the possibility or raise the possibility that the current attacks could be Gladio. The terrorist attacks are, I think, 99% of what we refer to as terrorist attacks in the West are false flag attacks. Not necessarily the case in terrorist attacks in other countries, because in Syria, for example, the terrorist attacks are being committed by Daesh, being committed by Al Qaeda. The state is not involved there. Foreign states are involved, of course. Whereas when they attack here, when Daesh and Al Qaeda target Paris and Brussels, then there's absolutely no way they could carry these kind of attacks out without some kind of state backing.
And that's the problem. People don't contextualize these things properly. They don't know the history. Like we mentioned Gladio, and to the extent that people aren't aware of that, they don't know how to contextualize or properly analyze current events, because there's a history here of false flag terror attack, strategy of tension. Of course, that was done in the Cold War context. Blame it on Maoists, or not Maoists, but Red Guards and communist factions, Baader-Meinhof, these types of outfits.
Yeah.
But it is to get a clear understanding of what's going on right now in Europe, perhaps even here in the States. We have our own little strange occurrences or incidents here. Is we have to understand that these are proxy forces. Al Qaeda was a proxy force. ISIS is a proxy force of the Atlanticist powers to destabilize, the heartland, right? The Mackinder Doctrine?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And the thing about it is, you said that if people don't have the history, they don't seem to understand nor the context. There's also, the fact that I think when you explain this to people, a lot of people are just not capable of dealing with it. They're just not capable of dealing with the truth. I think the social psychologists have this thing called systems justification theory. I think the basis of systems justification theory is that people have an inherent need to justify the system they're living under. That you kind of have to assume things are okay, assume everything, somebody's in charge, and there's some kind of justice in order for the society to function. And that's so a lot of people, even if you explain this to them, they still don't get it. They still don't get the fact. They cannot possibly imagine that guys in suits and ties, white guys in suits and ties, in the West would be capable of kind of diabolical actions like that they would be capable of creating something as diabolical as Daesh, because they can imagine that Muslims would do it. They can imagine that people in the global South and these countries would be capable of doing that, but they can't imagine that people in the West would be capable of this, of carrying out these kind of operations. And of course, the military-industrial complex is just so secretive, and we have people don't have any real information about what goes on. I think there's something like 800,000 people or more in the United States alone working under top secret. Mm-hmm. Top secret. I mean, there's an entire nation there of operatives, and it's the same, in Europe, obviously, and yet the public is completely unaware of what these people are doing. So also, of course, it's not surprising that we're seeing what's happening in foreign wars today and the war on terror, given the fact that avarice is now the main value of our society. Greed, greed is good, and profit is good, and egotism is good. We've gone to we're in a hyper egotistical society, and that that leads to the kind of production of sociopaths. And we're living in a sociopathic society run by sociopaths.
Yeah, the media even shows, even like entertainment, cooking shows, shows you wouldn't associate with the military industrial complex or national security, are being well, they have the support and guidance of the CIA and the Pentagon, and I do believe this is there to promote a certain psychopathy and narcissism that supports the system, right?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, and it's just we're so lies, deceiving people, and lying, and everything. It's just it's become pandemic because people have no values. They have no value system anymore. There are no morals in our society. It's a completely do whatever you want. Everything's about me and my my desires and my life and my profit and my property, and it's sort of that has become ubiquitous now, that whole kind of mentality.
But
And
that's
so it's
empire.
hard to
That's
surprise it.
that's
Yeah,
life under the empire.
absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
it corrupts everything, doesn't it? It gets into it corrupts the entire fabric of society. So that's one aspect with the terror campaign that's going on. It serves the another narrative that's kind of being fed by the war on terrorism is the notion of the clash of civilizations, and so this comes, of course, famously from Samuel Huntington's uh, works. The clash of civilizations is based on the idea that there is a kind of an incommensurability between the Islamic paradigm of a good society and the Western democratic or the Western Judeo-Christian um, paradigm of what constitutes a good society. And so that these two main civilizations are going to come into conflict when you have mass immigration into Europe of Muslims and so on. And this notion that there's an incompatibility between these two civilizations is very much a narrative which Zionists promote because the state of Israel, which is an emerging global empire, needs this narrative to justify the occupation of Palestine, the refusal to compromise, to enter into real negotiations with the Palestinians, to recognize Palestinian state, and so on. So it justifies Israeli aggression in the Middle East, Israeli expansionism, and it creates Islamophobia in the West because when you have terrorist attacks being committed by Muslims, then people are going to say, okay, maybe these were just some extremists, but at the end of the day, this comes from Islam. Islam's a problem, and you have a lot of Israeli promotion in the media. I mean, I don't know how many times I heard Israel being promoted after the recent attacks. The Israeli model of security. We need to be more like Israel, and so on. So the clash of civilizations drives the war on terror as well. And of course, the tragedy of it is that the vast majority of Muslims are people who, like people in Algeria, Syria, Libya under Gaddafi. These are just as open-minded and secular and as modern as everybody else. The Islamic fundamentalism is a Western creation, really. It's something that has been, instrumentalized by Western secret services since the 1930s, I suppose in the 1920s, when the British Secret Service established contacts with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. They've always used these fanatics to weaken progressive Arab leaders in the Middle East. They used them against Nasser, against the Assads, the father and the son, against Gaddafi. So these are tools. These are tools of imperialism.
Yeah, I can't. I don't think I can exaggerate the importance of that point. Understanding Western or Anglo-American, I guess, stoking of the Islamicist flame. to achieve a geopolitical end. That's the whole basis of Brzezinski's arc of crisis. They created the arc of crisis, then they used arc of crisis as a justification for intervention.
Absolutely,
Mm.
yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, Zbigniew Brzezinski's policies are of extreme importance to understand because, the long-term aim of these foreign wars is not only do they want to destroy Syria and break it up into four parts, balkanize the country, but they want to expand the war into Iran, balkanize that country if possible as well, and into Central Asia, which is an extremely wealthy region in terms of its natural resources. And so once it gets into Central Asia, then of course into Russia, the North Caucasus region is very unstable. Russia has demographic instabilities, rather demographic how should I put it, has a very big Muslim population, and that presents challenges in terms of the radicalization that's going on there. I mean, we saw that in Chechnya, where the United States was backing Chechen Islamists, Chechen terrorists like Basayev and others, and they were put down very effectively by Putin and Kadyrov. So Russia has lots of points of instability, and the West intends to exploit those. I mean, Brzezinski is quite open and honest about that in his writings. They don't disguise the fact that they want to destroy Russia and that they'd like to see the country, the Russian Federation, collapse. So that's kind of the end game this century. So I think the wars we're seeing now will continue in that direction. So the question, I suppose, for Russia and Iran, two major emerging powers, is whether they will be able to turn that tide and defend their borders and sufficiently to survive that kind of cataclysmic attack by the West. So, with respect to the migration crisis that I've been talking about for a while, and writing about, there are two. I think there are two main aspects to the migration crisis. One is obviously the foreign wars. Not only the foreign wars, but the financial exploitation of those countries by the IMF and the World Bank. Let's say pretty much all of Africa and the Middle East, which creates conditions of unemployment, which creates antisocial states. And then the wars on a lot of these countries. Somalia was destroyed. Sudan was destabilized by Israel and the United States, and they created South Sudan there, a civil war which lasted for decades and killed about 2 million people. You further destabilization there as well in Darfur, and that's also being instrumentalized by Western powers. You have the destruction of Iraq, which was the most prosperous nation in the Middle East. The destruction of Libya, again the richest and most progressive nation in Africa. These were multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-confessional countries that were progressing and doing well, and in the case of Libya, doing extraordinary things. Africa's first satellite, which was thanks to Libyan investment that Africa got a satellite, which enabled the continent to progress very rapidly in terms of technology, mobile phones. Libya provided cheap flights from Africa to Europe. So again, a lot of Africans were profiting from that. It had a very social state, a very distributive state, where each family would get a check from the National Oil Company every month. So it was considered the most egalitarian state in Africa. It had a direct form of democracy. Again, the media kept saying, about Libya that it was not a democracy. Libya was a democracy. It was a direct democracy, where they would not allow any political parties, but it was people would elect deputies to the National Congress, and Gaddafi did not actually have any official role in the state. He was basically a speaker in the parliament, but he had no executive authority. The Libyan Prime Minister Baghdadi, uh, the Libyan Prime Minister in place during the attack in 2011, this guy called Mohammed Baghdadi, and the Prime Minister used to be elected every 2 years. So Libya was a democracy. It had and a very progressive one. And obviously it had, like every country, none of these countries were perfect, but you could see all these countries were progressing and were systematically destroyed. And so hundreds of millions of refugees were the consequence of that. Almost half the Libyan population have been reduced to refugee status. They're in Tunisia, they're in Algeria, and all over the place. A lot of them coming across the Mediterranean. Then, of course, Syria. Most of the refugees are in Syria, in the areas controlled by the government. So a lot of those are coming from areas occupied by Daesh up at the north, and so the refugee crisis has that's one aspect I think to consider. The fact that you wouldn't have all these refugees, these millions of refugees all over the world, if you didn't have imperialism, be it financial or military. And the second aspect then is the way in which contemporary imperialism understands how to use a crisis to further imperialism. And so what they're doing is agencies linked to some of the empire's most important oligarchs, people like George Soros, are financing the transfer of people from the Southern Hemisphere, in particular Africa and the Middle East, to Europe. And that is essentially what is referred to as coercive engineered migration. Mm-hmm. It's essentially a population transfer. And it isn't, they intend, these strategists, people, again, I referred to already in my series on this for Dissident Voice, U.S. strategists like Thomas P.M. Barnett have said that for the 21st century, the way in which the United States will continue to rule the world is by making sure Russia is out of the picture. So that in the 21st century, there will be three major world powers: the United States, India, and China. And India and China will be either number 2 or number 3. China will probably be number 2, India number 3. Russia has to be out of the picture. And to get Russia out of the picture, you have to get Europe out of the picture. Because even though Europe is allied to the United States, but transatlantic treaty already going on, you've got NATO and so on. Germany's the big problem here. The long-term geoeconomic interests of Germany lie with Russia, union with Russia, because of the fact that Germany does not have the kind of access to oil and gas that it needs to fuel its economy. Russia needs German technology, and so there is a natural there is a natural alliance there, really, between Germany and Russia, which the United States is trying to prevent. Remember, again, that Germany is an occupied country since the Second World War, and there are thousands of U.S. troops still in Germany. And so the key geopolitical objective is to create an intermarium in Eastern Europe from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. You militarize that entire region and make sure that region stays anti-Russian. So that's why you've had all the color revolutions in the last decade in Eastern Europe. That's why there's a civil war in the Ukraine. It's about making sure that these countries are anti-Russian and then using them as a base for the destabilization and destruction of Russia. Germany has, in the last few decades, Germany has made significant overtures to Russia. I mean, there are lots of important projects. You've got Nord Stream, bringing gas through the Baltic Sea. into Germany. That's something that the Americans are quite worried about. Then you have South Stream, which again is another major Russian project to pipe gas into the Balkans, into Europe. So there, I think we're going to see an instrumentalization of the refugee crisis. We already have. I mean, the fact that they're paying a lot of these boats to bring migrants into Europe shows that essentially what they're doing is they're weaponizing the refugees. They're creating conditions of civil war. So I think we are moving in that direction in Europe. George Friedman, the head of Stratfor, has, more or less admitted that this is U.S. policy in Europe, that Europe is just going to have to go into a period of civil war. And when he made those remarks in the Chicago Council, I think it was 2014, if I'm not mistaken, the German Bundestag, in the Bundestag, the German parliament, there was a major debate about this, and there was outrage there. I mean, they were absolutely outraged, about what he was saying. So the people at the highest level in Germany are aware of what is happening, but because Germany, again, is an occupied country, most of the media is run by the CIA in Germany. That was admitted recently by Udo Ulfkotte, former editor of the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, which is the country's biggest most prominent newspaper, that most of the editors of all the major news media in Germany are run by the CIA. So that is a major problem. So the long-term objective of this kind of artificial transfer of people from the southern hemisphere to the northern hemisphere is to create conditions of civil war. And those civil war conditions will then lead to the kind of excuse for a European army, a European superstate, more security, and possibly occupation of Europe by US troops. That's already happening, actually, since the terrorist attacks. Now you have US troops, US operatives, patrolling the streets in Britain. You have the Israelis are becoming a lot more aggressive, and you've got Israeli teams also driving around, in Britain, in London. So you'll see a militarization of Europe. In the conditions of civil war will create that. And it sort of leads to a very deeply cynical politics where xenophobic parties like the far right in Holland, here in France with the National Front, kind of profit from people's fear of immigration. And one of the things I try to point out in my series on migration is that one of the big problems, one of the problems for the left generally, that's to say, kind of where I come from ideologically, is that Marxists traditionally never supported immigration. I mean, if you read works of Marx and Engels, they understood that immigration was a tool of the working class to drive down wages and to create division among the workers. And one of the reasons why the United States doesn't have a militant labor party is because of immigration. Anytime workers in the United States organized and got into unions and started making demands and started becoming conscious of their class interests, they liberalized migration law and got lots of immigrants in to take their jobs. And the result of that in the United States was that by the early 1990s, for example, most of the trades in the United States tended to be dominated by black people. And these were unionized black people who, were Americans. They were unionized and could get decent wages and make a decent living and maybe feed a family. Those workers basically became unemployed and unemployable and were replaced by cheap Mexican labor. And so the result is you have a pauperization of black people in the United States, where they're kind of now being criminalized. Most of them, a lot of people who would have been working good jobs in the past are now basically languishing in prison. And you have a constant influx of Mexican labor. And there's no unions, there's no organization, there's no party representing workers in the United States. So cultural homogeneity is important for labor organization, where people speak the same language and have sort of similar sense of themselves. You don't need racial homogeneity, but you do need some kind of cultural homogeneity. So when you get all these different cultures coming into Europe with all desperately seeking work, it's a recipe for smashing all the social gains of the last century, and that's essentially what what they're intending to do with the coercive engineered migration happening now.
That's such an important point there. Because both here in the United States and in Europe, there's been this weaponized migration. In the U.S., it was internal, the 20th century, when they broke up the urban cities, ethnic neighborhoods to create suburbia. It creates this sort of internal cosmopolitanism. You to write about international cosmopolitanism, but I think there's also domestic applications that here in the United States because it's such a big country.
Sure.
But it destroys that ethnic identity, which again creates an easy divide and conquer strategy. That's written about in E. Michael Jones's Slaughter of Cities.
Yeah, the thing is that it's very difficult. Like you can see it already in the mass movement of migrants into Europe already. That a lot of the fighting, a lot of the violence is happening between the immigrant communities themselves. Afghans are not getting on with Albanians or Syrians or whatever. There aren't actually many Syrians there at all. This is again, this is another reason for the media focus on the migration crisis last year was basically to say they were all Syrians and then to use that as a justification for bombing Syria, but there's only about maximum 20%, maybe 15 to 20% who are actually Syrians. So it's a terrible situation, and because of this ideological obfuscation that has happened, that's the kind of ideological obfuscation of the issue of migration. A lot of things are being overlooked, like the fact that in Calais, French working class people are, these are people who are really suffering because of what is happening to their city. In Calais, there's a lot of people getting beaten up every week by a lot of these young men coming from other countries who are themselves victims because they're basically living in terrible conditions in the camps there. The jungle, for example, it's absolutely dreadful, the conditions they're living under. They've got kind of nowhere to go, so they're going to end up being radicalized. They're going to end up, kind of almost having to get into gangs. I mean, you see this ourselves. We can see this, in kind of historically. I mean, it's like the Irish when they went to America. A lot of them joined gangs and became sort of, joined the street gangs and the underground and so on. These are the negative aspects of mass migration. But the suffering of a lot of the people in Europe who are experiencing the wave of migration in their cities is barely even mentioned in Western media, and where left-wing parties are not going near it at all. So you see this happening a lot in Greece, where the ordinary working class Greeks are freaking out over the fact that that the country is almost being overrun, and the state is collapsing, the social state is collapsing. There's unemployment everywhere. Their salaries have been, cut in half and more. And a lot of people like in some of those Greek islands where you have major migration crisis, so a lot of people are afraid to go outside their front door. And I know in Calais, it's the same. People are afraid to actually go outside their house. And a lot of people have actually been attacked in their houses. A lot of migrants, come in and actually just, rob people and come into their houses and so on. So that's another aspect that hasn't been covered by the media. And what happens then, of course, is that you get all kinds of nutcases who will exploit that, like the far right in Europe, the neo-Nazis and so on. So it's much. I've tried to in this series basically just introduces more complexity into the way in which this issue is being dealt with. I agree with critics of political correctness. I think political correctness is just it's awful, really. It's just an awful intellectual imposition, and something that we need to kind of rid ourselves of. We just need to, this sort of whole idea that you can't, you have to be for migration or for immigration, or why do you have to be in a certain way? It's and not only that, but it's sort of as soon as you try to describe the situation, you get people sort of calling you names. I mean, I've been called a fascist, racist. It's like
communist, everything.
Yeah, I mean, it's bizarre.
That's the psychological warfare.
When I discuss this with Africans, I've got very close friends here from different African countries. I have a very good friend here who's a writer from Cameroon. He's a Franco-Cameroon writer, actually. And I was discussing this with him in Paris recently, and he was saying, when my mother was trying to visit a few years ago, and she was having trouble coming here because of visas and controls and stuff. And he said, I'm looking out in the street and I'm seeing all this migration wave. And he said, how the hell are they getting in here? And he's like, this is not natural. This is not natural. This is not natural migration from Africa to France. There's something going on here. And a lot of my work on migration has been published in Africa. And then I get this sort of petty bourgeois, Western leftists, in inverted commas, calling me a racist. They don't seem to think that in Zimbabwe, because the Zimbabwean media have been interested in my analyses.
Mm-hmm.
And in Eritrea. But that mentality is quite prevalent in Western Europe. It doesn't exist in Eastern Europe, and in fact, in Eastern Europe, the main reason for that is that you had what they refer to as cultural Marxism, which was quite prominent in the West in the post-war period. Frankfurt School, this sort of
the long march to the institutions. Right?
Yeah, and the sort of bourgeois Marxism, essentially. It was Marxism which could fit into Western capitalist society without really posing any threat.
And they went into media in Hollywood.
Yeah, exactly. And the ideological roots are in Trotskyism. I mean, I didn't go into that much in the series, but I will in the book form, because I have it will come out in the book later this year with kind of more expanded version. But the ideological roots of that, what I refer to as this petty bourgeois leftism, are in Trotskyism. And that didn't take off in Eastern Europe at all, because when they had the popular democracies in Eastern Europe, there was never a conflict between the notion of working class, a society run by the working class, and a society that was conscious and proud of its nationality. Mm-hmm. So in the German Democratic Republic, for example, they would have national holidays and days when they would march and celebrate their national identity. They were proud to be Germans, and they were reasonably ethnically homogenous. But that doesn't mean that they were anti-foreigner, because they had lots of foreigners that they accepted into German society, particularly people from countries where there were wars. There was a lot of refugees from Vietnam, for example, and they were perfectly integrated in East Germany. Similarly, in the Czech Republic, a lot of Vietnamese perfectly integrated into the society, and there was never a problem with xenophobia. There was never a problem with racism, particularly there was never a problem with racism in these countries. I mean, I have a very good friend from Chad who was educated in the Soviet Union, and the people I've spoken to from Africa who were educated in the Soviet Union always spoke of very open, tolerant society in terms of foreigners. And of course, because that was the state ideology, it was it was internationalist ideology. So the countries in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union were never subjected to political correctness, which is why they're much more rational in their analysis of this crisis, and they're out of sync with Brussels because people like, let's say, Viktor Orban of Hungary, he's not having any of this. He's very much against the whole cultural Marxist ideology. He's basically asserting national sovereignty. And again, the point I try to make is that, a national sovereignty, the assertion of national sovereignty goes against the objectives of oligarchy and globalization.
Mm-hmm.
That's something they don't want. And so, we have to look at any leader who is asserting national sovereignty and who is coming up against the oligarchs in Brussels and Washington should be, I'm not saying we should necessarily call him a hero and everything, but when someone like Daniel Cohn-Bendit, the European Parliament member who called Viktor Orban, the Chavez of Europe, the Castro of Europe, when he calls someone like Orban the Chavez of Europe, it's not because Orban is like Chavez, it's because he considers anybody who threatens globalization to be a threat to his class interests. And so that's something that we should just be aware of. I see a lot of people demonizing Orban, calling him a fascist and far right and all this kind of stuff. And again, this comes from those petty bourgeois leftists, and their petty mindedness. They see everything as they're so petty. They have there's no profundity in their analysis. There's no concrete analysis. There's no complexity. Everything is just left and right.
It's talking point morality. It's bumper sticker depth.
They're kind of they're just like some really annoying. I don't know, parish priest who just kind of won't listen to anybody and goes around pointing the finger at everybody and moralizing. And I get that's a big problem with this. I mean, these people are a bigger problem really than they're a bigger problem than the imperialists. I mean, I'd give you an example in France. In the alternative of the mainstream media here, you have three main newspapers, right? You've got the conservative right-wing newspaper, Le Figaro. You've got the officially centre-left newspaper, Le Monde. And then you've got the left-wing newspaper, which is Libération. They're all right-wing. They're all imperialist. They're all the same, just like the United States, just like Britain, just like every other country. They all work for the same people.
Just like Wilmoth Buckley and Gloria Steinem work for the same people here in the United States in their day.
Yeah, I mean, they all work for the same people. But the thing about it is, astonishingly, when I want to get, if I was to choose between the three papers for an honest, a reasonably honest portrayal of the war in Syria, it would be the conservative right-wing newspaper, Le Figaro. It's the only paper that has actually criticized NATO imperialism in Libya and Syria. In other words, a very important point to understand, I think, is that imperialism, at least for the last 30 years, has been using leftist ideology to advance. So that the wars are being sold as humanitarian operations. These are all kind of left-wing issues. Again, bourgeois left-wing issues, human rights issues, things like that. So you've got human rights wars, humanitarian wars, attempting to stop a massacre. Like the traditional right would never have been interested in that, because the traditional right is, we rule and who cares, But it's this soft, this selling of the way in which imperialism is sold is through left-wing slogans. So you have the Arab Spring, which is presented, as left-wing, and again, all the leftists loved it. Absolutely loved it. Just swallowed the whole thing, left, right. No concrete analysis there either, and so the imperialism is using left-wing slogans and pursuing a deeply right-wing agenda in terms of economics, austerity, getting rid of all the social gains, any kind of social security, reducing man to, an automaton and so on. So it's something that needs to be pointed out. So, left wing and right wing don't really exist anymore in any real sense. You've got to sort of just look at the facts the way they are and try to, I guess, so that's why in my analysis, I've used stuff from all kinds of sources, and
Yeah, yeah.
try to make an analysis. Sometimes I read something like Viktor Orban's policies, in Hungary. A lot of it is quite progressive because again he's very pro-Russian. He wants good, decent relations with China. He's very friendly to left-wing countries like Venezuela. It's got big projects there, development projects in Venezuela. So he's actually kind of pursuing a multi-vectored, multipolar foreign policy, and these are just things that we should highlight, and analyze. So yeah, I mean, this is there's been kind of a dearth of decent critique, I think, of the migration crisis because of the fact that it's just been analyzed in terms of whether you're for or against migration.
Yeah, it's the same thing occurred here in the United States with the mass migration north into the cities. That was done to weaken the largely white labor unions. But back then you had ethnic neighborhoods, and there was a lot of reasons why that was done. That was part of a WASP-Jewish alliance.
Sure.
To weaken the Catholic Church,
sure,
and change the demographics and therefore the politics of the country to usher in the American century. And there's
sure.
we don't have time to get into that now, but there's a very complex and very interesting history behind that. But yeah, you mentioned, it's very predictable if you send in tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of migrant immigrants or refugees, and largely male in an area, you're going to have a lot of problems, a lot of crime. And that's foreseeable, and I think I think the end game is I think you alluded to it, is converting Europe into some sort of gladiatorial pit, weaken it.
Yeah, I mean, if they didn't destabilize Europe, they understand that eventually Europe would get out of the war against Russia because it's not in European geostrategic economic interest to be at war with Russia. It's costing industrialists here billions and billions.
It's insane. It's absolutely insane.
Yeah. And so the Austrians they're already outside. I mean, they went to Moscow recently and affirmed their support for Russia. They're already outside NATO, even though they're inside officially. They're in their minds psychologically that country is sick and tired of what's going on, and it's very obvious. So they're not happy with it. Hungary is not happy with this situation. Poland is basically it's slightly different. There's a slightly different regime there. It's conservative as well, but again in a positive sense. Conservative in the sense that it's trying to reaffirm some traditional values. Against which are kind of anti-globalization. But Poland is deeply anti-Russian, and so that's going to be interesting to see in what direction Kaczynski brings Poland. But they're not being attacked for anything bad by the European Union. They're being attacked because, again, they're going in a kind of an anti-globalization direction. So a lot of the countries in Slovakia, they've been very critical as well of NATO and of the foreign wars. The population of Serbia, the majority are pro-Russian. So even though the government, it's a Quisling government, essentially is dragging the country, kicking and screaming into NATO. Macedonia, the Macedonian government is deeply critical. So you can see that in Eastern Europe that the NATO alliance is crumbling, and people are beginning to realize that if this continues, we will find ourselves in a situation where we'll have civil war. I don't know how bad that will get, but we already have civil war in Europe. We already have it in Ukraine. And and we've already had it in Yugoslavia. And again, the former Yugoslavia is still a deeply unstable region. You've got the conflict in Macedonia, which was stoked up by the United States again last year. Attempted color revolution there that failed, but you've got the problem with Greater Albania. A lot of Albanians in the flows coming up to Germany. So there are all sorts of things they can do with a crisis, and I think that's what we're going to see increasingly. And then we've got just the way in which the crisis is being managed. You've got companies like ORS Systems in Europe, absolutely creaming. I mean, just making massive profits out of just cattle, just shifting people around like cattle. The slave industry is now is a growth industry in Europe, essentially.
And heroin.
Yeah, the slave industry, drugs,
yep,
and guns. These are all parasitic industries. In a way, you could say that the sort of parasitic industry, these non-productive,
destructive,
destructive, yeah.
And they thrive in these contrived gladiatorial pits.
Exactly. They're in a way, the productive economy, the economy that makes machines and cars and planes and that
farms
use, is being taken over by the arms and war and drugs, and you're seeing a kind of that aspect to it as well. Where
I think Catherine Austin Fitts calls it the tapeworm economy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's a good term,
But yeah, you mentioned that. I mean, cheating with your time here because I hate this. You're being so concise and so pointed here. But I hate to cut it off. But I don't want to be the cause of domestic.
Well, I get into trouble. Yeah.
Disputes. I know you. I know it's afternoon and it's Paris in spring. It's afternoon there. I don't want to rob you of that.
I'm gonna have to go to the park with.
Yeah. So, but yeah, I said I cheated, but you're on a roll here. I thought it'd be a crime to interrupt. But yeah, on point here. You mentioned NATO, and of course, the Yugoslav War, in '95 and '99 were contrived by NATO, to justify continued military presence there, to break up the pipelines that were being planned, or to secure the other, the pipelines, and also to secure the heroin traffic coming west.
And I mean these industries are so important. Heroin. When you look at all of these. When you look at the underworld, which is growing all the time, drugs. I mean, look at the heroin industry in Afghanistan. It's just the statistics vary, but I think it's something like 500% it's increased by since the NATO occupation.
Mm-hmm.
So there's massive amounts of heroin produced. That money is goes into Western banks,
mm-hmm.
and provides a lot of liquidity
mm-hmm.
for those banks. They said that one of the reasons why a lot of those banks didn't go down after 2008 was because of drug money, and it goes right through the system. And then look at the sex industry. All of the children that are disappearing. Something like 10,000 children from the refugee crisis this year have gone missing, have disappeared. I don't know what the actual statistics of children disappearing every year in the United States are or globally, but I know they're massive. It's it's just really frightening. Children disappearing. And so you've got, look at the political elites, look at the pedophilia in the political elites. It's unbelievable. I mean, the British press, the mainstream press in Britain, have pretty much revealed the fact that, there are pedophiles in the British government who haven't been apprehended yet, and that there were many pedophiles in Thatcher's cabinet. And these are child murderers and child rapists, and nothing has been done about it.
I know what's happening here with Denny Hastert, what's been admitted here.
It's all over the justice system. It's all over the political system. I've already mentioned a pedophile on this show. He's pretty much... I won't mention it again, but the guy I mentioned earlier has pretty much been shown to be a pedophile as well. It's deeply it's deeply shocking and corrupt. So that's another industry that's growing. You've got the enslavement of women. I mean, that was particularly the case in the former Yugoslavia, in Kosovo, Albania. Albania, since the end of socialism there, women have been sold into slavery. It's a huge industry. Russia, of course, experienced that
Yes.
during the Yeltsin years, the enslavement of women. So, and these are growth industries. I mean, they're not getting, all of this is growing. The illegal arms trade is growing.
The same thing occurred in the same thing occurred in Weimar Germany.
Yeah,
The reaction, the bitter reaction. Yeah.
So where these industries these parasitic, destructive industries are creating massive amounts of capital, and we don't have right now. We don't have what we really need is a revolution in consciousness. People think that by going out in the street and making a big fuss out of things, that's going to change things. I think first of all, people need to see the connections between all of these things, and then it needs to be a kind of revolution in terms of their ideology and their value system. That needs to change, and that the sort of going out in the street and demonstrating, it's important, of course, it's very, very important, but it's not it won't change the world on its own. We need.
Yeah, this requires a reversal of more than a century of Bernaysian,
brainwashing. Yeah,
brainwashing, and that gets in the same methods that turned us into mindless soldiers marching off to war, jingoists. It also turns us into mindless debt-ridden consumers.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean. So yeah, I mean, I suppose common platforms are important as well. People, because there's a lot of people who are against this kind of world, but are divided on ideological lines. And so I guess the common platform is so important that people say, look, well, we might disagree on, the nature of the solution. I would say communism, being a communist. Other people would say some kind of return to, religion, revival of Catholicism. And I read a lot of these authors, and I find their works really interesting. But I think that what people need to look at. Part of what I try to do is just to educate people about the truth about the Soviet Union, because I'm constantly reading nonsense about the Soviet Union. It's just unbelievable, and a lot of people just won't see that it was a lot more complex. And refuse to read the stuff. They just won't read. They won't read if you read that series, I make a lot of points about the Soviet Union. They won't even read it. They see the Soviet Union as a Jewish conspiracy and so on and so forth, and they're closed-minded.
They cherry pick. They find parts of evidence that supports how they view the world, and they cling to it.
Open-minded. All I'm saying is people need to be open-minded. I'm prepared to read anything, and look at it and try and make an analysis of it and change my mind. I mean, how many times have I changed my mind? I mean, I guess I have to change my mind almost about something every year. Something I thought was true, and it's like, oh my God, I no longer believe this now. It's like. I'm used to it now, so I don't mind if somebody says, "Here, this book is really good. Thought about this." I'm like,